This should not exist, but it does. A human body, sealed for centuries, that appears to reach out beyond death, leaving behind a pattern so disturbing that those who came into contact with it did not simply fall ill, they died. Not once, not twice, but enough times to make even the most skeptical investigators hesitate. Science tells us that a mummy is nothing more than preserved tissue, dried by time and environment. And yet, in this case, something about that explanation feels incomplete. As if a simple body has been mistaken for something far more active. The story begins in the early days of modern archaeology, when explorers were still opening tombs with more curiosity than caution. Deep beneath layers of sand and stone, a burial chamber was discovered undisturbed, sealed, and strangely intact. Inside lay a mummy unlike others. The wrappings were unusually well preserved, the markings unfamiliar, and the chamber itself carried symbols that did not fully match known burial traditions. At first, it was celebrated as a rare and valuable find. But within weeks of its discovery, the pattern began. One of the workers involved in the excavation fell violently ill and died. Then another. Then someone who had only briefly handled an artifact from the chamber. The events were dismissed as coincidence, until they weren't. At the surface level, there is an explanation that seems almost too convenient. Ancient tombs, especially sealed ones, can trap harmful bacteria, fungi, and toxic gases for centuries. When disturbed, these elements are released into the air, exposing anyone nearby. In fact, modern science has documented cases where spores from ancient environments can cause severe respiratory failure. It is a clean, rational explanation. One that fits comfortably within what we understand about microbiology. But there is a problem. Not everyone exposed to the tomb fell ill. Some who spent hours inside survived without symptoms, while others who had only indirect contact, touching a transported object days later, experienced fatal consequences. The pattern does not follow simple exposure. It behaves selectively. This is where the mystery deepens. As researchers revisited the records, they noticed inconsistencies that biology alone could not fully explain. The timing of the deaths varied. The symptoms were not always the same. In some cases, individuals showed no signs of infection at all, yet their deaths were sudden and unexplained. A new line of inquiry began to emerge, one that shifted the focus from contamination to something far more complex. What if the environment of the tomb had altered the body itself? What if, over centuries, chemical processes had transformed the mummy into a kind of reactive system, capable of interacting with the modern world in unpredictable ways? Several theories began to compete for answers. The first remained grounded in science, suggesting that rare, ancient microorganisms unknown to modern medicine could behave differently than expected, adapting rapidly to new hosts. The second theory moved into the realm of chemistry, proposing that compounds used in the mummification process had combined with environmental factors to create toxic residues, activated only under certain conditions. And then there was the third theory, the one that many dismissed but few could entirely ignore. The idea that belief itself, the psychological weight of a curse, might trigger extreme physiological responses in those who encountered the mummy, leading to real, measurable consequences. None of these theories fully resolve the mystery. Each explains part of the pattern, but not all of it. And then came a breakthrough that complicated everything further. A team of researchers conducted a detailed analysis of materials taken from similar burial sites, focusing on the microscopic and chemical composition of preserved remains. What they found was unexpected. Certain compounds, formed over long periods in sealed environments, could interact with human biology in ways that were not immediately obvious. Disrupting cellular processes, interfering with neurological function, even triggering cascading failures in the body without the typical signs of infection. It was not a curse in the supernatural sense, but it also was not something easily categorized within conventional science. And yet, even this discovery did not close the case. Because when the data was compared to the historical accounts, something remained unresolved. The distribution of effects still did not align perfectly with exposure. Some individuals who should have been affected were not. Others, with minimal contact, experienced the most severe outcomes. It suggested that whatever mechanism was at work, it was not purely external. It required interaction, perhaps with the individual's own biology, or even their state of mind. Imagine standing in that chamber. The air is still, heavy with centuries of isolation. You know the stories, even if you don't believe them. You reach out, just for a moment, to touch something that has not been touched in thousands of years. In that instant, nothing happens. There is no immediate sign, no visible change. And yet, days later, something begins to feel wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to make you question whether the past is truly as distant as we think. In the end, the most unsettling part of this story is not whether the mummy was cursed. It is the realization that our understanding of the boundary between life and death, between past and present, may be far less complete than we assume. What we call a curse might simply be a phenomenon we do not yet fully understand, a complex interaction of biology, chemistry, and perception, shaped by time in ways we are only beginning to explore. And if that is true, then the real question is not whether the mummy caused these deaths, but how many other mysteries we have already encountered, quietly dismissed, simply because they did not fit the explanations we were ready to accept. There have been cases where exposure to ancient spores has led to respiratory collapse and systemic infection. It is a clean explanation, one that fits comfortably within the boundaries of known science. And for a while, it was enough. Reports were filed, warnings were issued, and the incident was quietly categorized as an unfortunate but understandable consequence of disturbing an ancient environment. But the more closely the events were examined, the less stable that explanation became. Because the pattern did not behave like contamination. In typical cases, exposure leads to clusters, people in close proximity, affected within similar timeframes, showing similar symptoms. That is how biology usually works. But here, the sequence was uneven. Some individuals who spent extended periods inside the chamber showed no symptoms at all. Others, who had minimal or delayed contact, sometimes days later, in entirely different locations, experienced the most severe outcomes. The timeline fractured. The cause no longer aligned with the effect. This is where the investigation shifted. Quietly at first, almost reluctantly, researchers began to consider that the environment alone might not be responsible. Samples taken from the chamber were reanalyzed, not just for biological agents, but for chemical transformations, subtle changes that occur over long periods in sealed systems. Over centuries, organic materials do not simply decay, they interact. Resins, oils, minerals, and even the wrappings themselves can combine under pressure and isolation, forming compounds that do not exist in open environments. What they found was not dramatic at first glance. There were no obvious toxins, no single substance that could be pointed to as the cause. Instead, there was complexity, a network of compounds that, under certain conditions, could become reactive. Not universally dangerous, but potentially disruptive when introduced into a living system. It suggested something unusual, that the mummy was not just preserved, it had been chemically transformed into something else. Not alive, but not entirely passive either. And yet, even this did not fully explain the pattern. Because if the cause were purely chemical, the effects should still follow exposure. They should be predictable, measurable. But they weren't. The inconsistency remained. And that inconsistency forced a deeper question, one that moved beyond biology and chemistry into something far less defined. Could the human body itself be part of the mechanism? A small group of researchers began to explore this possibility, focusing on the interaction between external stimuli and internal response. The human system is not just physical, it is neurological, psychological, adaptive. Under certain conditions, belief and perception can trigger real physiological changes, altering heart rate, immune response, even cellular behavior. This is not superstition, it is documented in studies of extreme stress and placebo effects. But here, the idea was taken further. What if the individuals affected were not just exposed to something external, but were reacting to it in a way that amplified its effects? Three main theories began to form, each attempting to explain the full pattern. The first remained grounded in microbiology, suggesting that an unknown or extremely rare organism was responsible, one that did not behave like typical pathogens, perhaps interacting differently with different hosts. It was the safest theory, the most conventional, but it struggled to explain the inconsistencies. The second theory focused on chemistry, proposing that the mummification process, combined with centuries of isolation, had created a set of compounds that could interfere with human biology in subtle but dangerous ways. These compounds might not be immediately toxic, but under certain conditions, they could trigger cascading failures within the body. It was a stronger explanation, but still incomplete. The third theory was the most controversial. It suggested that the curse was not a single external force, but a feedback loop and interaction between the environment and the human mind. That expectation, fear, and belief could act as catalysts, altering how the body responds to exposure. Not causing the effect on their own, but shaping it. Amplifying it. Turning a minor disruption into something far more severe. At first, this idea was dismissed. It sounded too close to myth, too far from measurable science. But then something changed. A later analysis, conducted with more advanced tools, examined not just the materials from the tomb, but the biological data of those affected. What emerged was subtle, but undeniable. There were signs of systemic disruption, irregularities in neurological signals, unusual stress responses, and in some cases, rapid deterioration without a clear biological trigger. It was as if the body had entered a state of internal conflict, reacting to something it could not fully interpret. And that is where the real shift occurred. Because the findings suggested that the phenomenon was not purely external, and not purely internal. It was an interaction. A convergence point where environment, chemistry, and human perception overlapped in a way that produced outcomes none of them could create alone. But even this was not the final answer. Because when researchers attempted to replicate the conditions in controlled environments, the results did not fully match. The compounds could be isolated. The biological responses could be observed. But the exact pattern, the sequence of events that defined the original case, could not be reproduced. Something was missing. Something unaccounted for. And that absence may be the most important clue of all. Because it suggests that whatever happened in that chamber was not just a product of materials or methods, but of context. A specific set of conditions, aligned in a way that may not occur again in exactly the same form. Time, isolation, human interaction, all combining into a single, unrepeatable event. Imagine knowing that. Imagine being one of the people who stood at the edge of that discovery, aware that you are interacting with something that cannot be fully explained, cannot be fully predicted. Would you still reach out? Would you still touch it, just to understand? Or would you step back and accept that some parts of the past are not meant to be fully uncovered? Because in the end, the idea of a cursed mummy may not be about curses at all. It may be about limits. The limits of what we understand, and the consequences of crossing into areas where explanation lags behind discovery. We often assume that time separates us from the past, that what is ancient is also inactive, irrelevant. But this case suggests something else entirely. That the past is not always silent. That under certain conditions, it can still respond. And that when it does, the results may not fit into the systems we rely on to make sense of the world. So the next time you hear a story dismissed as myth, as exaggeration, as something that belongs only to imagination, consider the possibility that it began with something real. Something observed, but not understood. Something that left just enough evidence to be remembered, and just enough mystery to remain unsolved. If you found this story interesting, make sure to like the video so more people can discover mysteries like this. Subscribe to the channel for more deep, story-driven explorations into hidden history and scientific anomalies. And share this video with someone who still believes that the past has nothing left to reveal, because sometimes, the most dangerous discoveries are the ones we think we already understand.